Picture this. It is 1896. You are an antiquities dealer living in Baghdad, at the time, part of the Ottoman Empire, and you have something you'd really like to sell. It is 186 ancient clay tablets covered in one of the oldest known writing systems in the world. There is, however, one slight problem. The Ottoman Empire has an antiquities law, and exporting archaeological artifacts is strictly verboten. You've actually been hiding these tablets in your house for about a year because you're worried authorities might confiscate them. But you have a buyer in mind, the British Museum. You just need to get these 186 ancient tablets out of the country through customs onto a ship and eventually all the way to London without anybody noticing. So you pack them up and hide them in a bag of aniseed. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the show where we explore the strange intersection of food history and true crime. And today we are talking about what? Sprinkles. Which naturally means we're also going to talk about antiquity smuggling, licorice, the ancient Greeks, and why hundreds of thousands of people, including myself, have volunteered and continue to volunteer their time training for ye old 26.2 miles, the marathon. Now you might be wondering, why sprinkles? Well, it is rather simple. I do love a sweet treat, and basically saw sprinkles on a donut, I think on the walk home from one of my runs, and so I was like, hey, wait a minute, where do sprinkles come from? So let us start at the beginning. What even is anise? Anise, aniseed. You can get into some really dangerous territory when you try to pronounce anise, but that's technically how you say it, or at least one of the technical ways you say it. It is part of a plant. It is a plant. Seems obvious. But then you kind of think to yourself, hold on, there's anise, star anise, fennel, then there's the actual plant of licorice. And one thing they all have in common is one of my least favorite flavors ever, licorice. They are not the same plant. Anise, for example, is in the herb family with parsley. Fennel is related to itself, basically. Star anise isn't particularly closely related to either of those. It actually grows on an evergreen tree native to like parts of Asia. And licorice is yet another plant where the flavor traditionally comes from the root. So why do they all taste like my nightmare? It's because they have a chemical called anethol, and that is the licoricey flavor. It's a major component of like aromatic oils in, again, anise, star anise, and fennel. And it's responsible for some of that like really distinctive, sweet, licoricey flavor. And as I mentioned, part of my nightmare, definitely not helped by a large number of Jaeger bombs consumed while living abroad that have given me other types of nightmares. But anethol itself is actually kind of an interesting substance. It's kind of oily, so it dissolves well in alcohol, which is why we've got things like ouzo, pastis, arak, I think is what it's called, absinthe, Jägermeister. And fun fact, if you add water to those, your drink will actually get cloudier because the oil from the anethol actually will become like these little tiny balls of oil suspended in the water, so it looks cloudy. That is literally called the ouzo effect. Pretty cool bit of science, and we love science on this show. But we're talking about sprinkles, not about Jaeger bombs. We're interested in one particularly important use of anise, because eventually someone in the Netherlands looked at it and thought, you know what this needs? Bread. Now, the history here is a little bit messy, but safe to say, in the 1910s, D.E. Dieperink, director of the Dutch licorice and confectionery company Venco, reportedly came up with the idea for little white, crunchy, anise-flavored pieces that could be sprinkled onto bread. According to the story, preserved by the Amsterdam City Archives, Dieperink got the idea on a gloomy autumn day while it was hailing outside. And in Dutch, hail is hagel. So, hagelslag essentially evokes a hail shower, tiny pieces raining down onto your bread, and this became a thing. Hagelslag is sprinkles. However, that is aniseed. Again, not everyone's cup of tea. So someone remembered that chocolate exists. The chocolate company Vence began making its own version of kind of small little chocolatey sprinkles for bread in the 1930s. Then chocolate hagelslag became an incredibly recognizable part of Dutch food culture and basically took over the old anise version because it was a breakfast. Basically any meal, but I associated with breakfast because I spent my summers in Germany, and there I literally had this delectable treat, which is bread, butter, sprinkles. That's it. That's the whole thing. And it was chocolate sprinkles for me. You can have that at any time. It is an absolute treat. Fun fact, in Belgium, chocolate sprinkles have also acquired a unique name, which I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation of, Mützenstrontjes, which basically means mouse droppings. Yummy. If there are any Belgian listeners, please tell me why y'all decided on that name. Could have been anything else. Literally anything else. And in case you're wondering how these little hagelslags or sprinkles are made, it's actually a really simple process. It might vary a little bit by manufacturer, but basically you mix together powdered sugar, shortening, water, some sort of starch, and food coloring. You mix that together into sort of like a doughy paste, squish it through a form, make these long spaghettis, goes onto a conveyor belt, dries, goes into basically like a concrete mixer thing. As it's rotating, it breaks into the equal sized sprinkles. Then they sift out the smaller pieces and the larger pieces. And that, my friends, is how we get evenly sized, delicious little sprinkles. Now, I have to say, the mixing part of the colors is a very enjoyable and satisfying way to spend 5 minutes on YouTube. But here's where we need to pivot a little bit because I mentioned we're going to be talking about marathons. So far, we've only talked about my nightmare fuel in the form of licorice and also cute little sprinkles that are sometimes named mouse poop. But this is where we go back to the plant part of our segment, and that is fennel, because the ancient Greek word for fennel is marathon. Pew, pew, pew. It's coming together. And fennel apparently grew abundantly around a particular area in ancient Greece, an area that also became known as Marathon. Yes, that Marathon. The way my timbers shivered when I read that. In 490 BCE, Marathon became the site of a major battle between the Greeks and the invading Persian army. The Greeks won, and this is where we got one of the most famous running stories in history. According to the version most of us have heard, a messenger named Phidippides ran from the battlefield at Marathon all the way to Athens. When he arrived, he announced the Greeks had won and then immediately croaked, which is certainly one way to dissuade people from training for a marathon. Totally fair. However, it doesn't seem to be the actual story. In fact, the actual story is a little scarier. Our earliest major source of the Battle of Marathon is the Greek historian Herodotus. And Herodotus does mention a runner named Pheidippides. But his run is completely different. Before the battle, the Athenians needed help. So Pheidippides was sent from Athens to Sparta to ask the Spartans for military support. That is a journey of roughly 150 miles. Ooh, that's a long way. According to Herodotus, Pheidippides covered it in about 2 days, which is both incredibly amazing and alarming. Can you imagine the chafage? I'll just leave that there. The real version actually involves more running than the legend, but Herodotus doesn't give us the famous story of Pheidippides running from Marathon to Athens, announcing victory and dying. Versions of that story seem to show up later in history. And over time, the pieces merged into a legend we recognize today. And normally, it might have remained just that, just a legend. But in 1896, Athens hosted the first modern Olympic Games, and organizers wanted an event that connected the new Olympics to ancient Greece. And the legend of the runner from Marathon was basically perfect. Perfect PR. So they created a race from Marathon to Athens. The first Olympic marathon was actually only 25 miles. I didn't realize this, but 40 kilometers is only 25 miles. I've been telling everybody that 40 kilometers is a marathon. Anyway, 40 Ks is 25 miles. 17 runners started, and suddenly an ancient legend had become a modern sport. And the idea spread almost immediately. Members of the Boston Athletic Association were in Athens for those Olympics. They saw the marathon and they were like, we must have this. In ye olde Massachusetts, the following year, in 1897, they organized their own race. 15 runners started, 10 finished. That race eventually became known as the Boston Marathon, and it is now the world's oldest annually run marathon, which is crazy. I've always heard about the Boston Marathon. I knew it was like a big deal, but I never understood why. And I've spent a lot of time with runners, but now I know. This is so exciting. However, that Boston's first course was again only around 24 and a half miles. The modern marathon distance of 26.2 miles, or like 26 and 385 yards, or 42.19 kilometers, wouldn't become the standard until later, until the British Olympic season later, where they changed the course to be 26.2 miles to kind of match some whims of some people there. And for decades, marathon running remained a fairly niche sport. Even Boston could have surprisingly small fields. And FYI, if you've never heard about it, that place is packed every year for that marathon. But then recreational running started exploding in popularity in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s. And you can actually see this in the Boston Marathon numbers. In 1960, 200 runners. 69, 1,300 runners. 74, 2,000 runners. 78, 4,700 runners. Can you guess 1979? If you said 8,000 entrants, you get a gold star from me. Virtual, of course. So by then, running had transformed from something primarily associated with competitive athletes into something basically ordinary people did for fitness. And eventually, completing a marathon became a goal itself, which has created an entire modern industry around shoes, training plans, watches, hydration, food, and may I just add, anti-chafage material. And if you've been listening for a little while to this delightful podcast, I've actually gone down the rabbit hole of food and hydration during a marathon and as someone who's completed a marathon and hangs out with ultramarathoners, where did all of that type of food come from? In episode 33, we talked about goo, energy gel, and the disastrous 2007 Chicago Marathon, where extreme heat overwhelmed aid stations and hydration problems turned the race into chaos. It's a great episode. Go ahead and listen. But here's another random little nugget of this story that I love so much. So remember when the modern marathon was created? 1896. And remember in the beginning of the episode, we were in Baghdad. What year was it? 1896. So while athletes in Greece were preparing to run the first modern Olympic marathon, Elias Gaju, apologies, was trying to move those 186 ancient tablets out of the Ottoman Empire. He had purchased them. He's keeping them on hand. He's trying to offload them and get paid. So he has connections. Somebody by the name of Frank Bottomley, an agent for the shipping company Lynch & Co., knew Wallace Budge, E.A. Wallace Budge, who was the keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum. So in May 1896, Gaju writes Budge. He doesn't really ask if the British Museum wants the tables. He basically says they are coming. So he's got the 186 tablets packed into 4 cases, traveling from Baghdad to Basra, then to Bombay, and eventually on to Britain. But he didn't explain that. The details survived because Bottomley told Budge. And so by the summer of 1896, they had reached London. And although they were still sitting in bags of anise, when they arrived at the British Museum, somewhere along the route, the tablets were apparently removed and repacked for the rest of their journey, which I find such an odd detail and also makes me go a little bit conspiracy of are they the real tablets? Regardless, Gaju's like, hey, British Museum, give me money for something you did not ask for. And they're kind of we already have the tablets, so your price of 250 pounds respectfully decline. How about 30 pounds? He's kind of sitting there going well, I didn't think about this part of the negotiation. And he says, fine, can I have a few extra pounds? They're like, all right. You get 32 pounds in 1897. In today's money, that is 6,192 big American buffos. So after this wild ride, I guess there's only one question left. If you eat anise-flavored sprinkles, does that make you a marathoner? That's it for this week's True Crime Culinary. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And also, come back every Thursday. There's a new episode that drops, and it's bite-sized, delicious, delightful. See you next week.